about to go, yeah. Okay. As I was saying before, I was interrupted by a dead laptop, so thank you for your welcome. And as I said, this is a talk on Palmerstown House, as I was explaining earlier. Yeah, so the actual title is Palmerstown House, Burning, Compensation and Rebuilding, 1923-1927. Still okay down the back, just to be sure? Good, okay. So I've actually divided this into 6 sort of parts, just to make it easier. I mean, the final part is all about the compensation, but you can't speak about the compensation unless you give the context to the house, how it was built, how it was burdened, what happened afterwards, etc., etc. And to speak a little bit about the family who lived in the house at the time of its burning. So they were the Burkes of Kildare. I'm just going to speak about when they arrived in Palmerstown House. It's not certain when the family arrived, but from research that Brian McCabe, some of you will know Brian in the Kill History Society, has done, he thinks they came during the Cromwellian period when they replaced the Flatsbury, or the Flatbury, they were a Norman family, we think around 1648. Then the Burkes came, they settled, a man called Theobald Burke was appointed the first Earl of Mayo. They were the Earls of Mayo in 1785. The most notable member of the family was the famous 6th Earl, Richard Southwell Burke, who lived from 1822 to 1872. He's commonly known as the Pickled Earl for reasons I won't go into here tonight. But he got into politics. He was appointed Chief Secretary of Ireland in 1852 and got a subsequent appointment. He was appointed twice, and of course that was like the Taoiseach, that was like the Prime Minister of Ireland. He was the Chief Officer of the British establishment in Dublin Castle. But in 1868 he got a major appointment. He was appointed Governor General and Viceroy of India. And like in a global scheme after Victoria, that was the 2nd greatest title in the world to have. And he was assassinated out there 4 years later. A very progressive man by all accounts, much loved in India, like the British Empire and India don't go too well together. But he was a progressive man and was highly respected by the Indian people. So he was assassinated in 1872. And as was common at the time, there was a move almost immediately to build a memorial to him. Now, when you think of memorials, think of going to Dublin and looking up at the Phoenix Park and seeing the Wellington Monument. That was a memorial to Wellington, the Duke of Wellington. Some of you will probably remember Nelson's pillar on O'Connell Street. That was a memorial to Nelson. So this was common in the Victorian era for the great and the good if they died unexpectedly or for their country or their empire, to do something on their behalf when they came back. So there was a move immediately that they would do something for this viceroy who was murdered in India. So, as a tribute to the assassinated Earl, a public subscription was arranged to build a suitable memorial in his honour. And for some reason, we can't find out why, but the family came to the committee and said, "We'd like a new house." So, apparently the old house wasn't in great shape. So they agreed that they would fund building a new house for the Burke family in Palmerstown. And the money was raised, and the new mansion house was constructed in 1879 with a mansard roof floor at the top containing 13 bedrooms for the household staff. Normally the staff lived downstairs, but in this new house they were living upstairs at the top of the house. And there's a plaque over the entrance notes that it was built by his friends and countrymen. It's a Queen Anne style house. They say I'm not an architect. Thomas Henry Wyatt, a very famous English architect, was the architect for the house. And the interior plaster work was very special, and that was undertaken by a firm from Dublin called James Hogan and Sons. There was a meeting in London to kick off this memorial fund. Here's the front speeches delivered by His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, the son of Queen Victoria, chaired the committee for what was called the Mayo Memorial Fund on the occasion of its inauguration. And here are the list of the great and the good who attended. It was a public meeting held in the Willis's Rooms in London in 1872. His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh and the chair was unanimously revealed to raise a fund which, under the direction of a committee of subscribers, should be applied in such a manner as to evince admiration for the late Lord Mayo as a distinguished Indian administrator and valued public servant whose qualities and private life endears him to all classes, creeds and parties. And there's a list of the great and the good of Britain at the time, whom were giving in the money to fund the house. House was built. Here's a photograph of him in his viceroy robes, the sixth Earl, and there's the house. That's the house that was constructed. Yeah, beautiful house, I must say. And that's the mansard roof. So it's, I think it's from the French. They're the 13 rooms that were at the top of the actual house. So that was the house that was in situ in 1922. Okay, so then we move forward 50 years later, 40 years later, 45 years later, it's 1922. It's the Civil War in Ireland. A very unfortunate event, but it happened. And one of the features of the Irish Civil War was the number of big houses burnt, destroyed. So burning big houses was a feature of the War of Independence and the Civil War. But there were many, many differences why they were burnt in both conflicts. But there was about 300 houses in total burnt during the two conflicts, the War of Independence and the Civil War. 100 in the War of Independence and 200 in the Civil War. And there was many reasons for such attacks on these houses. So, there was probably three reasons why in Kildare there was attacks on two of the houses in Kildare, Palmerstown and Motherboden were the two houses burnt in Kildare during the Civil War. Palmerston on the 29th of January and Motherboden up by Ballymore Eustace a few weeks later. There was many reasons for such attacks, but obviously it was a very volatile time in the country. In September 1922, a month after Collins's death, the government brought in the Public Safety Bill, which gave extra judicial powers to the army to carry out executions, like without going through a proper judicial system, and you could be executed for carrying an arm or a gun or a weapon. And then in particular, of course, here in Kildare and the Curragh in December 1922, there were 7 anti-treatyite volunteers executed. I know that some people here, I know that Mario Corrigan has done some great research, obviously, on this particular incident. And then in December 1922, the first W.T. Cosgrave appointed 30 senators, and they were primarily from the Loyalist Unionist community. Lord Mayo was one of them, the 7th Earl. And they were targeted by Liam Lynch, the head of the anti-treatyite forces under Operation Order Number 16. He said, "You are promoting government policy with regard to executions and prosecuting the Civil War. You're a target and we will burn your houses." So of those 30 senators from the Protestant Loyalist community, I think 27 of their houses were burnt, including Palmerston House. So as I said, they were destroyed in early 1923. Okay, so that's the background, and now just moving to Palmerstown itself. What actually happened on that fateful night at the end of January 1923? So there's a photograph of the 7th Earl, Dermot Burke. He's the son of the assassinated Viceroy of India, Dermot Burke, the 7th Lord Earl of Mayo. He's Dermot Robert Winton Burke. He's the 7th Earl. He's finishing dinner. It's about 9:30 at night with the Countess Geraldine, his wife. Knock on the front door. The butler goes out. There's two guys at the door. They grab his pocket watch and they put it off and they try to get into the house. They slam the door. They can't get in. The butler goes in and tells there's some trouble brewing. There's a party of anti-treatyites around the house. They get entry about an hour later, we think at around 10:30, through the back door, through the servants' quarter, and they announce that they have orders to burn the house. Lady Mayo, there's a bit of an argument in the hall. Lady Mayo says, "How can you burn this house with its beautiful contents?" And the volunteers said, "We have our orders, ma'am." They gave about 20 minutes to say, "Look, you have 20, as happened in a lot of the other burnings, you have 20 minutes to get what you have out of the house, but we're going to burn it." So they had 20 minutes to remove whatever they possibly could. You can imagine the panic. The Burkes were a major hunting family with the Kildare hunt. So the riding gear was brought out almost immediately to save that. Some paintings. There was a lot of art in the house. They were great collectors of art. This man. But they sprinkled. They brought in. I'm not quite sure. They pulled curtains off the wall, off the windows, piled them up. They had brought petrol and set the house, set the blaze going. Broke the windows. It was a winter's night. Wind went through the house and the blaze took off. So obviously there were some unsuccessful attempts to fight the conflagration. A wet and windy night, the house was completely destroyed. Yeah, a fire. Was back in the Curragh. The Free State Army saw in the night sky the blaze north of Naas, as you would, I guess, and a few officers came up and they did their best to help. A fire tender came down, but you can imagine this house was just blazing. The house was completely destroyed. And there was only one of a number of big house burnings. I mean, the newspapers tell us that there was two other houses. Milestone Castle, County Louth, was burned that night. Kiltira House in South Dublin. The home of Sir Horace Plunkett, who was a man who was trying to encourage Irish agriculture. But again, he was in the Senate, so he was another target. They burned his house. And there were some other mentions in Dublin, minor attacks on other houses as well. Very considerable newspaper coverage. I'll show you a photograph in a moment. The Irish Times sent down a reporter 2 days later. There was still smoke coming out of the house. He did see the Earl. He didn't speak to him actually, but he saw him still trying to get something out of the house, trying to salvage, I guess, some furniture perhaps or something. But there is a quote from Lord Mayo, who was asked, was he now going to leave the country? And he said, I will not be driven from my own country. I mean, this is back to the question, were they English, were they Irish, were they Anglo-Irish? He said, this is my country. We've been here for hundreds of years. I'm not leaving my own country. Anyway, so there's a photograph of the burned house, yeah, from the Irish Times. So you can just contrast that with the photograph I showed 3 or 4 slides back. The lovely mansion with the gardens. This is the Irish Times newspaper coverage. Again, a photograph on top. That's Sir Horace Plunkett, and that's his house in Kiltira, South Dublin. Palmerstown again. Lord Mayo, I think probably taken. He looks a bit shook, so I take it it was taken when the Irish Times came down to talk to him. So that was, the country was going through a very upset time at that point in time. Okay, so that's just, the house is gone, and then the matter of compensation comes up, and I want to talk about that. So compensation was a very contentious matter, financial compensation for property lost during the War of Independence and the Civil War. So in 1898, when the local government restructuring was done and the county councils were established and the town councils, public liability as a risk was passed on to a lot of councils. So even today we have a bit of that, where if your car gets punctured in a pothole, you can make a claim off the county council in theory. But that legislation didn't stand up during the War of Independence, so there was further legislation introduced before independence by the British government in 1919 and in 1920. But it was a very confused situation because the court system had broken down. And while the courts were giving adjudications in the War of Independence, there was no settlements. The county councils were run by Sinn Féin at this stage, so they weren't settling any claims. So I've come across tons of incidences where houses were, this is War of Independence time. We're saying, there's a claim of 40,000. We're currently on Castle Bernard back in Bandon in West Cork, a massive house where he got £48,000. But there was nobody paying it. Cork County Council weren't going to pay this entitled gent down in West Cork for the loss of his house. So it was a very confused situation, as I said. Courts were adjudicating, but there was no remedies. Lots of these houses had insurance in both the War of Independence and the Civil War, but of course small print. In time of conflict, we're not paying a claim, and there's a conflict going on, so they were getting out of it as well. And then, I guess in early 1922, when the treaty was passed, because the treaty was a very general document with regard to the Anglo-Irish treaty at the time, there was a lot of things to be ironed out, and one of them was compensation. So in early 1922, after the passing of the treaty, the Irish and British governments announced that each side would cater for the losses they had inflicted during the War of Independence up to the truce of 1921. So, and then they set up a commission called the Shaw Commission to look at all of that, and that took its own course of action, and there was an Irish Grants Committee set up to give compensation. That was War of Independence stuff, and there was still the Civil War issue. So the government then, the Free State government, the new government, had to separately deal with damages to property that arose during the Civil War period. So they moved pretty early. I mean, in November 1922, the war was still going on until May of 1923. They passed a resolution in the Dáil, and W.T. Cosgrave made a speech, the Taoiseach of the time, obviously, the head of the government, made a speech saying that we have to get this sorted. And bills were to be introduced, but the Dáil rose for Christmas, and nothing happened until February, when legislation was introduced. It was debated over the following weeks, and it was signed into law on the 11th of May 1923 as the Damage to Property Compensation Act 1923. And there was three parts to that act. There was three parts to the act, and I'm not going to go into the detail because this is a piece of legislation that's very hard to communicate about in sort of layman's language. But I guess part 2, section 10 is important, and that applied to any property claims. Now, not personal injury claims, property claims incurred between the 11th of July, the date of the truce, 1921, and the 12th of May, 1923. That was the official ending of the Civil War. For that 2-year period, this Compensation Act would apply. And with regard to big country houses, there were 2 levels of payment were allowed: full reinstatement or partial reinstatement. And if you got full reinstatement, you got the money, but you had to rebuild your house as was, which is really rebuilding your mansion. Now again, I won't get into the detail, but like these houses were, until the Wyndham Land Act, when they lost their estates, were really, the income stream was coming from the rents payable by the tenant farmers by and large, you know. So when that income stream disappeared, you know, like there were huge houses to run, and there was very little money to keep them going. So very few went down the full reinstatement route, but there was a partial reinstatement settlement that was also offered, which was that you could rebuild a smaller house on the same site or close to the same site. The government were adamant that if you got compensation, you couldn't take it out of the country. They'd made a major mistake. Well, a major mistake had happened with the Wyndham Land Act, when the landlords got the settlement and the land passed to the tenant farmers who became owners of the land, and that money left Ireland and was invested in the London Stock Exchange or off to New York, because America was about to begin this great age. But the Free State government said, if you get an award, if you're successful, you've got to use the money in Ireland, and you've got to use it to rebuild your house. Now, there's a little twist here that I'm currently doing some research on. There was a possibility also of not rebuilding on site, but building residential property elsewhere in the Free State. So if you got a positive award, saying, yeah, we're going to award you money to either partially or fully reinstate your house, within 90 days of that decree from the court, you could go back to the court and you could say, I've decided not to build at all, but I want to take the money and build property, residential property in Cork or Dublin in the Free State. And a few of them did that. I'm currently doing some research on that. I've come across 9 claimants who looked at that particular option, and there's houses today built in Dublin, in Glasnevin, Drumcondra, Donnybrook, out in Dalkey. There were big houses that they built, but they used the compensation money to build properties in those areas of Dublin with a view that they would get the rental income, or they would speculate, that they would build a house and sell them on. Now, I'm not getting into that here tonight, but I am currently doing some research on that particular area. Okay, you also had 90 days to make your claim. Once the legislation was passed in May, you had 90 days to make your claim anyway. You know, a very short period of time, 3 months, although that was later extended. So in July, then this thing was passed in May. 2 months later, they brought a forum in which you would make your claim. And the original forum had to be served on the clerk of the relevant county or county borough, with a copy to the State Solicitor and the Department of Finance. And the first schedule of that required the full and precise details of the claim. And then the second schedule required a narrative on the circumstances of the loss and details of any insurance policies in place. Now, this damages this act was not just about big houses. It was about all losses, property losses incurred in the Civil War, of which there were 19,000 claims made. Now, I thought we were never a litigious people until I saw these files, okay? So 19,000 claims were made under this Act, in theory within 90 days of the Act being passed. And of those 19,000, I discovered 333 were from County Kildare. Now, the great thing for us who study history is that the Department of Finance opened a file on every single claim that was made. Now, some of these claims were for bicycles. I mean, having looked at the files, I said there wasn't a bicycle left in the country. They were robbed by the Free State Army or the Irregular Army. Our motor cars, our pubs where the Free State Army went in, or the anti-treatyite army, and said, give around the drinks to my men, please, and send the bill to the government, or to De Valera, or whoever, you know. And it's utterly fascinating. Now, the great thing, is that those 19,000 files over the past 20, 30 years have been transferred to the National Archives, and are all held in the National Archives in Bishop Street in Dublin. The bad thing is there's no digital record. You've got to go in and you've got to find the catalogue, county by county by county by county, and you can see the claims. And it is, I mean, there's a vast area of research yet to be done with regard to these claims. But I'm only looking at the houses, okay? Those 200 houses that made the claim. But just to give you some background to all of that. So that's the forum. Okay, so then looking at Palmerston House itself and the Palmerston compensation claim. So he was very quick off the mark. I mean, before the Act was passed in the Dáil, he had made his claim. Now he was a senator, so I guess he knew this was coming out. So on the 8th of May 1923, they submitted their claim. It was submitted on an interim claim forum pursuant to the Dáil resolution of the previous November, which I mentioned. And then later on, the Palmerston claim details were transferred to the official prescribed forum with the same details. And there was some press coverage that he intended to rebuild his mansion, but on a smaller scale. There is that prescribed forum. Sorry, now. There's the forum that I found in the file. Just to say, sorry, I should also say, I mean, I mentioned the 19,000 claims that were made and the 19,000 files that were transferred over, but it's never exact. When I went in to look for the Palmerston file 3 years ago in the National Archives, I couldn't find it. It could not be found. You know, it's, oh gosh, because I was keen to pursue this. And the staff in the National Archives are beyond helpful. They said, look, we didn't get every file. Like, they were kept in the basement of the Department of Finance for 50 years, 60 years. So in theory, we should have got all the files, but if you can't, if it's not in the catalogue, that's the end of it. And I was about to give up. But then I went to the National Library of Ireland, which is the other great national repository of our history. And I found the nugget, because the legal firm which Lord Mayo used was called White and White in Dublin. And it looked like in the 1950s they gave their full legal file into the National Library, known as the Mayo Papers. And that file had everything, you know, really. So this forum, I was able to take a copy. So that's just the first page of the actual forum. Yeah, so I got lucky. Yeah, so just on the application, so Schedule 1, he was looking for £70,000 to rebuild the house. He valued his house contents were 20,000. Now, they had salvaged some of it during the night of the fire, so they were taking off 4,500. Architect's fees, Arpin was the architect, so those of you who might know Irish art, William Arpin, one of our great artists, this guy, Caulfield Arpin, was his brother, ran a very successful architectural practice in Dublin. So between the digital and the real, the total compensation claim was £93,663 in the initial claim. Now at this stage, they hadn't actually they hadn't received quotations to rebuild the house, so the 70,000 was an estimate. But the architect's plans were sent on to a quantity surveyor for costings known as J. Graves Clayton, again a well-known practice in Dublin. But at this point in time, they hadn't got an actual quotation to rebuild the house. So this 70,000 was an estimate. Okay, this is just again part of the application. You can see the 70,000 up on top to rebuild the house at this point in time. And then when you work down through, you'll see the contents of the house. I mean, linen, ornamental and decorative china, glass, musical instruments, pictures, personal wardrobes, silver and plate. And you can see here what they salvaged. They're taking out what they're salvaged to get a net amount of 96,000. Okay. So as I said there earlier, there was insurance on the house. They had got the house insured and the contents insured. The insurance company said, sorry, it's an act of war. We're not paying out. You had to make that declaration. Are you claiming any insurance, as part of your claim for compensation? It was a detailed inventory you saw on the previous slide, and a cost breakdown also submitted. And then in November 1923, the formal notice was served by White and White, his firm of solicitors in Dublin, to Kildare County Council, to the Civic Guards, to Garda Síochána, the Ministry of Finance, the Department of Finance, and Mr. Ronald Brown, the State Solicitor for County Kildare. Now, while this was submitted in 1923, it took 2 years before the case was actually heard. So it's a 2-year period. Now again, I mean, this is no surprise. 19,000 claims submitted. Kevin O'Higgins was the Minister for Justice. He was just rebuilding the court system. So they were utterly inundated with claims coming in. I have even when the claim was heard in 1925, it was on a Saturday. Now, I need to check, did courts sit on Saturdays? I guess they didn't, but because of the backlog, I'm quite certain they said we have to sit on Saturdays to clear the backlog of actual claims. So anyway, once the submission was made in November 1923, there was immediately Brown and McCann, solicitors in Naas, were acting for Naas Urban District Council, and they wrote in saying, we want a copy of the claim as well. And there was this correspondence back and forth. They requested a copy of the claim documents, but White and White refused, citing particulars most voluminous, and it runs to 1,800 pages in the file that was supporting his compensation claim. And they wanted costs. They said, we got to copy this off. This was before photocopiers, I guess. And this went on back and forth. There was some very nasty correspondence between Brown and McCann in Naas and White and White. Indignant correspondence between both firms over the following few weeks. White and White sought senior counsel opinion, Edward White. There was a lot of Whites because another firm called White and something else. But Edward White was the legal advisor to Lord Mayo. He was a senior counsel. And the impasse was broken when he forwarded a closely typed document of 600 pages to Brown and McCann detailing furniture valuation. But even though the architect's plans for the new house were complete, the quantity surveyor report was still awaited. They still didn't have the cost to rebuild the house at this point in time. Okay, then I'll fly through this because I'm just conscious of time, obviously, as well, folks. But the case was then listed, was not listed in January 24, wasn't listed for the quarter sessions in Naas. We then moved to the following summer. We're in the summer now of 1924. Ronald Brown, State Solicitor in Naas, inquired with the status of the plans and rebuilding estimates, and then he wanted detail on the contents and the furniture claim. Response from the Earl directly, almost immediately advising that the contents of the house on the night of the burn fell into 6 categories. I won't give you that detail, but he had kept a very detailed list. It looked like that in 1918 there was a fire in the house. It didn't do damage, but it obviously caused a great concern because they brought over a firm from London called Gord Johns and Company, who were specialist valuers for the contents of big houses. And they valued every single item in Palmerstown house. It ran to a couple of hundred pages, you can imagine what the contents were. And Lord Mayo had that report, which he sent on to the Board of Works at this point in time. Now, what was happening at this point in time as well is that the government were settling a lot of the claims for the contents between the two parties. They weren't going to court. They were calling the Board of Works, the OPW, to say, look, can we come to a settlement on the contents? And the courts were only dealing with the property itself, compensation claims. Okay, and here is, so this is an extract, the detail of the following, 220 pages was what this valuation firm, the report contained, 220 pages of the content of the house. And again, I just won't go into the details, but just to give you that. We're now moving forward. The big thing here is I've since discovered that the quantity surveyor, so we all remember 1916 O'Connell Street and the damage done. O'Connell Street had never been rebuilt by the time the Civil War happened. Then the Civil War happened, then the Battle of O'Connell Street went on for a few days in June into July 1922. But the quantity surveyor involved was massively involved in costings rebuilding Dublin. So he had contracts for all those, Upper O'Connell Street where the Gresham Hotel is, and from the GPO south to the river. He was massively involved in all of that work, and he wrote to say, look, I'm very busy, I will get to Palmerstown, but obviously it was at the bottom of his list. So there's back and forth. In November, the quantity surveyor advised that he was awaiting tender quotations from the various builders. December 24, the case was tabled at Naas, but it would be adjourned if the rebuilding estimates were not finalised, and they weren't. There was some progress reported on a settlement offer of £14,000 for the furniture and contents, which was rejected by Lord Mayo. And then into 1925, the Board of Works were pressing for details so that they could check the claim, because that was their job. So the government engaged with the Board of Works to say, look, is this a valid claim? What about the estimates? Can you also go and get costings, etc., etc.? Okay, so finally, on the 4th of March 1925, a firm called McLaughlin and Harvey responded with a quotation of £35,000 to rebuild the house, half the price of the initial estimate. The amount was substantially less than the amount originally claimed, which was £70,000. Then that quotation was sent into Kildare State Solicitor and the Board of Works, and there were some supplementary claims for architects, quantity surveyor fees to almost £3,000, £200 for removing debris from the house. So the total quotation was £38,278. Okay, we're now at March 1925. And here's a copy of that's the quotation from McLaughlin and Harvey to rebuild the house, £35,000. Again, I found it on the file. So then, for some reason, it was listed to be heard in Naas in the courthouse on the 4th of June. It was adjourned. The hearing was adjourned. It wasn't heard. As I said earlier, delays in compensation hearings were very common at the time. There was continuous delays. I think number one, they were inundated. Number two, the state was very watchful. I mean, I found a file recently. The morning after this act, the Damages to Property Act, was passed on the 11th of May, the Chief State Solicitor called together all the county solicitors to Dublin and said, we will challenge every single claim made. Okay? Now you read all debates and they're on about, we have to, of course, compensate people for the losses incurred. But the official policy on the file was, we will challenge every single claim made. An automatic objection, So, between the hearings and objections, and rebuilding the court system, you can imagine why there were so many delays. Anyway, we move on, and we're coming up to Christmas. Finally, I found confirmation that the compensation hearing would be heard at 11 o'clock in the morning of Saturday, the 5th of December 1925 at Naas Courthouse. A lot of activity in the days coming up to the hearing, preparing the Lord Mayo's side. And the hearing was before Judge Charles Francis Doyle. Judge Doyle, I'll come back to him if I get a chance in a couple of moments, because he features a lot in these compensation claims. So anyway, that's fine. Finally, the hearing will actually happen. There's just white and white. are writing to another firm called White and Mears, and then there was an Edward White, so there was a lot of Whites for some reason involved in all this. It's just confirming that we applied today the opening sittings of the Kildare Circuit Court to Judge Doyle, and he has now fixed this case for hearing at the courthouse in Naas on Saturday the 5th at 11 a.m. in the forenoon, when all the witnesses will be required to be in attendance. Counsel will be required to be there punctually and open the case, okay, so on and so forth. Okay, so then he has senior counsel, so there's a man called Phelps and Myers are instructed by White and White, and the key issue would be to prove that the new house would be more valuable than the old one, would not be more valuable. That was a very big issue. You couldn't build something that was more valuable than the previous house, and there were, again, I'm very conscious, the state was just being established, they had very little money. No wonder they were going to fight, they were going to appeal every single adjudication. The witnesses were notified, final review of all documents took place. I found the file was a consultation in Phelps' offices on the 11th of November. And he confirmed that the claim would be dealt with under Section 10, subsection 10.4a Act, which is full reinstatement. So at this point in time, indicated that Lord Mayo would be seeking compensation for full reinstatement of his house. Now, the furniture and contents. So I said there's two parts to the claim. There's the house and there's the furniture and the contents. This was also tabled for adjudication on the 5th of December. But as I said, a lot of these claims were settled out of court in negotiations between the legal firm for the state and the representative of the claimant. So negotiations were underway, though Phelps advised that if an offer of $16,000 was made, it would be well to accept same. 25th of November, Lord Mayo happy to accept that offer, but the Ministry of Finance was only offering $15,500. And then there was on the 27th of November, this is about 2 weeks before the claim for the house itself, a telegram from Lord Mayo to his legal advisor to accept the offer of £15,500 if paid at once. And then he says in a further telegram, the matter is now off my mind, which is a relief. And here are the telegrams. They were found in the file. So on the left-hand side, it's accept offer £15,500 for the Burton furniture if paid at once. And then a few days later, he's a very patient man. Getting money out of the government is always hard, which can imagine 1924, 25, how hard it must have been. 2 days later, he's saying, have Board of Works paid, or are they resisting, and is Ministry of Finance delaying payment? It took him about a year to get the money out, but within 2 or 3 days, he's looking to see have they paid the money. And then he's obviously very impatient, because the following day, answer my telegram at once, fully, Lord Mayo. and this is Edward White, writes back, Ministry will pay on judge's order, which will be made on Saturday on proving malicious destruction. So, yeah, you could make a settlement, but you had to wait for the adjudication, that it was a valid adjudication, So anyway, but that's the furniture sorted. £15,500, the valuation agreed for the contents of the house. So we're now moving towards the hearing in Naas. There's a request for a John's representative to come from London to validate their report of 220 pages from 1918 on the valuation of the house. But of course, then it's settled, the contents are settled, so there's no need for him to come. Now, they did discover that the McLaughlin and Harvey quotation excluded the cost of the mansard roof. So that's that 13-bedroom extension at the top of the house from the original house from 1879. And then they've discovered, one of them discovered in the quantity surveyor's office, he came across the plans of the previous house, the house built as the memorial to the assassinated Earl. And it was, it said that there was a possibility of that cost of the 1879 construction could be in the hands of the state. They weren't sure, and it could be very damaging to Lord Mayo's claim. So obviously the house was built for much cheaper, 45 years earlier, than the claim going of 35,000, and they weren't sure, but they were prepared for that if it actually came up. And then, of course, for good order, the state said, we will find another quotation. So they consulted with a firm called J&P Good and another building firm, J&P Good and Company Limited, to also quote to rebuild the house. just to make sure that they were going to get a proper, that it was a fair estimate from McLaughlin and Harvey. And then Mr. John Good, who was a senior partner, was likely to be called by the state. Then the state had their own legal team, a Mr. Lupton and a Mr. Sheehy, and they were instructed by the state solicitor, obviously, Mr. Ronald Brown. So it's the morning of the hearing at 11 o'clock. Phelps, on behalf of Lord Mayo, opened the case by describing Palmerston as one of the most beautiful houses in the country. He noted that a settlement had been reached on the contents, so the primary matter was to fix the amount of compensation for Lord Mayo, whose intention it was to rebuild the house and live in it thereafter. And he said that he wished to rebuild the house in the same style as previously, but with no mansard roof. Now, they did get into a debate about, well, is this full reconstruction, then not partial reconstruction? It actually didn't really matter too much. But the judge queried, is this a full or a partial reconstruction condition? Was that being sought? And they sort of said, well, the Earl was seeking full reconstruction, but the rebuilt house would be of a character less valuable than the original house. That was very important, as I said earlier. They didn't want to be seeing houses built on the back of the state, of state money, being grander than the previously destroyed houses. You know, fair enough. Then the actual sandstone facings were from a quarry in Rosenallis in the Slieve Blooms of County Laois, and they would be required to replicate the fabric of the house. A whole pile of witnesses were called: Lord Mayo, Mr. Orpin, the architect, Mr. Clayton, the quantity surveyor. John Cleary was a director of McLaughlin and Harvey, the firm selected to build the house with the quotation. Then Mr. Frederick Hayes on behalf of the government, and then Mr. Thomas Burden, principal architect of the Board of Works. So these were all very busy people at the time. Now, this is where it gets somewhat interesting in that this is a summary I found of on this column we have the McLaughlin and Harvey quotation that we talked 38,000, the house is 35,000. Then this is Mr. Hayes on behalf of the government saying we can build a house for 27,000, substantially cheaper than the McLaughlin and Harvey quotation. Then that assessment was revised by Mr. Hayes from the Board of Works, and he actually came back up to 29,000. And then the other firm of J.P. Goods was 31,000, all cheaper than the quotation from the McLaughlin and Harvey firm. And I mean, this is where it becomes, there's still unfinished research to be done here, okay? And I'll explain that in a couple of moments. And I'm just watching the clock as well, folks. So they heard all the evidence. That document was submitted. We're not sure was that submitted, but I mean that's a summary of the various costings put in, which indicates that the most expensive quote was from McLaughlin and Harvey, and that the house could be rebuilt cheaper if another firm was used, and also government officials were giving their view on all of this. So it was adjudicated for 3 days until the 8th of December, when they met again in Naas Courthouse. It was a huge coverage in the Leinster Leader and the Kildare Observer of the actual court hearing on the previous Saturday morning. So the judge summarised the case heard over the previous 3 days, the usual that I've heard from both sides, and I've got the quotes, and I'm happy to, noting that the contents claim had been settled, would be part of the award decree. He noted that the Earl was not claiming for the full restoration, but limited his claim to the cost of building a substitute house, but much less expensive than the prior house. The new house would still be a stately one, but would cost less by many thousands of pounds than reinstatement of the original property. And this is where it just gets a little bit grey. And he said by this patriotic action, Lord Mayo had relieved the state from a very large sum of money. In return for this gesture, the claim should be met with every consideration by the state, and he paid tribute to the moderation with which the claim itself has been prepared. And I think he's referring, and this could have been a trick to take off that top floor, that mansard roof, and saying we're really building a smaller house, less valuable, and maybe somewhat less impressive than the previous house. And then he set out 3 conditions for Lord Mayo before his decree and awarding costs. So number 1, he said, Lord Mayo must be allowed to choose his own architect, surveyors and contractors. Fine, then he can do his own thing with these people. He must be allowed to exercise, at the expense of the state, the same discretion in respect of accepting or rejecting their suggestions at the prices and otherwise, which he, acting as a reasonable and prudent man, might be expected to have exercised in that respect if he was dealing with his own private money. So he, giving him quite a bit of leeway as well to do what he wished to do. And finally, he must not be required to accept the lowest tenders or to run any serious risk by adopting, as of necessity, the cheaper of the two competing methods of working. And then he noted that Mr. Hayes, the government advisor, original and revised estimates were not the figures for a formal tender. Mr. Hayes' role was to play devil's advocate. And he said only two respects in which he should reduce the McLaughlin-Harvey quotation. One, a reduction of £600 to reflect the continued decrease in the price of materials. Hard to imagine, and this is true, I've checked the figures, we're living in inflationary times, but in the 1920s deflation was in place. The price of materials was falling year by year. So he was saying that if the since the quotation came in 6 months ago, the price of materials has fallen, and I'm taking off £600 off the McLaughlin-Harvey quotation because of that. And number two, he said that any cost savings in items classified as provisional, there were some provisional items, if they came in at a lower price, any savings should fall back to the state. They shouldn't be claiming for the full costs. And he then decreed an award of $36,231 for house rebuilding, and he approved the contents of £16,500, giving a total award of £51,831. A very substantial amount of money. Probably, it's very difficult to translate money in pounds from the early mid-1920s to euro today, but this is millions of euro. This could be possible 4 million euro. 4 million to build that house. That a very poor state was giving that money out, and this wasn't the only claim. Now, there are some issues here. There are some issues that have yet to be investigated fully. And he also awarded costs and expenses to both parties. Now, as I said earlier, I've seen the file. Every adjudication, if it's against the state, must be appealed. And he thought he had his money, but he hadn't, because the Minister for Finance appeals the rebuilding award a few days later, on the 15th of December 1925. But it's withdrawn a month later. And there's a handwritten letter then on the following day. Now I must get them to pay up. How long will they delay? So again, they weren't giving out the money willy-nilly. You had to begin the work. You had to get your foundations in. Now the 4 walls were still standing in Palmerstown, so they didn't have to start building walls. But you had to do a certain amount of work and then send in your claim, and then they paid you in instalments over the full period of the rebuilding of the actual property. So the first payment was not actually made until December 1926, a year later, when 2,700 was paid. That's the appeal notice, don't need to see that. Yeah, that's the handwritten note. Dear White, this is about, this is on the 20th of January when the appeal was withdrawn. He now knew that he was on his way. Receive as follows, that the appeal has been withdrawn. Many thanks for informing me. Now I want them to pay up. How long will they delay? Thank you. How long will they delay? But as I said, he clearly didn't seem to know the rules, that we won't be giving it. It's £51,000. The contents, yes, I think they would pay those. That £15,500 would have been payable almost immediately. But they were not going to pay for the house until it was built, and that the money was invested locally, and again for very good reason. Like carpenters were employed, and masons and builders and quarries and electricians and plumbers and all this sort of stuff. So they were very wise, I think, to say you can't take the money out of the country. You must either rebuild your house or use the sub-clause about building properties in really primarily in Dublin as well. Okay, so that's the first payment. Yeah, just I thought that was interesting. December 1926. They're served directly by the Minister for Finance to transmit the enclosed paying order of £2,700, which includes £700 architect's fee, and represents the first instalment payable to your client, the Right Honourable the Earl of Mayo, in respect of the Property Compensation Act 1926. Details showing how the amount is arrived at is given below, and then they're keeping a running total. I've seen these files; they're on for a couple of years, until the final instalment is paid and the debt is settled and the full compensation is paid. Yeah. That's really it. I just have, am I okay for to take a few more minutes, or am I out of time?
Keep going.
Because I've just done some further work, okay, because there's very unusual, there's a very, I mean, as I said, there's still unfinished business here to be investigated. Because there's not a lot of research done on the compensation for these houses. Now, Professor Terence Dooley in Maynooth University, maybe known to many of you, is the recognised specialist in this area of Irish history. In 2022 he published his great book Burning the Big House, the story of the burning of the great mansions of Ireland. And Professor Dooley has estimated that the average settlement that people got from these claims was about a quarter, 25%. Was what they got. They were beaten down in price. So those alternative quotations that came in were dealt with properly. And for various reasons, they were beaten down in price, etc., etc. But Palmerstown is a total outlier. And I've done some recent research on this for something I was working on. And I think we got 15 or 16 houses here who made claims. And this is the blue line, if you can see, is the amount claimed, and the amount in red is the amount awarded. Now, if you see at the very bottom, you've got Mitchelstown Castle, the biggest house in Ireland. They claimed about £175,000, and they got about £45,000, and so on and so forth. But you see, Palmerston is halfway up. They've got almost everything they asked for. I mean, the next slide makes that clear. So these are the percentages they got. Palmerston got, I think, about 95% of their claim. Now this isn't, it's a fairly good sample, but it's not every house that made a claim. Like Moore Hall is actually listed here. Like they were getting 20, 30, 40% max. And the questioner, and this is, I mentioned Judge Doyle, who was the adjudicating judge. Judge Doyle also adjudicated Palmerstown House in County Wexford, yeah. The home of the Grattan Esmond family, a great Irish family going back to Henry Grattan's time, you know. And I mean, he was also in the Senate, and they burned his house. But my God, I mean, I've seen an MA thesis in Maynooth on that burning and that compensation claim. He was beaten down in price. The man kept a diary. He was utterly shattered by the whole experience, you know, and said, "I've been robbed. They won't pay me. I'm getting a terrible deal." The same judge adjudicated both cases. So there's another area of research. Why did Lord Mayo get such a good deal in Naas? Why did this man in Enniscorthy get such a terrible deal, you know? And he did some other, now he was a very learned judge. He died quite early in 1927, a very smart man. But, you know, there is, I've been asked a question by my people in Maynooth. Tell us, why is Palmerston such an outlier in this story of compensation of big houses in Ireland? And that remains to be done. And I have a few things in mind, but I don't have any answer to that question yet, but I'll be working on it. So the house was rebuilt without the mansard roof, as you know, and then it had a bit of a colourful history afterwards, because the Mayo sold it on in 1929. There's from the 1950s, a beautiful aerial shot, and there's a more modern. Yeah, but again, it is missing. When you see the original photograph of the mansard roof, I mean, it takes from the house, I think. Yeah. But the house, so he died in January 1927, just as the house was being finished, and there's a photograph of his obituary. Okay, in Maynooth we're trying to give our sources an acknowledgement, so there are all the various sources I used in my thesis. Thank you for your time.